The summit hall falls silent as Kieran Blackthorne stares across the room, his face draining of color. The Omega he publicly rejected 3 years ago now sits beside his greatest rival, wearing Luna marks and radiating power he never imagined she possessed. His mistake is about to cost him everything. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. Whispers echo through the Northern Territories about a woman who shattered every rule of pack hierarchy, about a Luna who wasn't supposed to exist, about revenge served cold enough to freeze bloodlines. But this story doesn't start with triumph. It starts with humiliation, with words spoken in front of hundreds of witnesses that would haunt one alpha for the rest of his life. 3 years ago, those words seemed like the end of everything. Today, they're remembered as the beginning of his destruction. The ceremony hall was packed, every member of the Silvercrest pack pressed together to witness what should have been a celebration. Alara Moonwhisper stood at the altar in the traditional white bonding dress, her hands trembling slightly as she watched Kieran Blackthorne approach. She'd known him since childhood, had grown up believing they were destined for each other, had accepted his courtship with a heart full of hope and certainty. The mate bond between them was undeniable, recognized by their wolves, blessed by the moon goddess herself. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Kieran stopped 3 feet away from her, close enough that she could see the coldness in his eyes, far enough that everyone in the hall could witness what came next. His father, Alpha Blackthorne, sat in the front row with an expression Alara couldn't quite read. Kieran's mother looked away, her jaw tight with what might have been shame or resignation, and Kieran himself stood tall and proud, dressed in the formal black uniform of an alpha heir, radiating power and absolute certainty. The elder conducting the ceremony cleared his throat, beginning the traditional words, but Kieran held up his hand, stopping him mid-sentence. The hall fell silent, so quiet that Alara could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Something was wrong. Everything was wrong. She could feel it through the bond, could sense Kieran's determination, his resolve, his complete lack of doubt about what he was about to do. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Alara saw nothing but dismissal in his gaze. "I cannot do this," Kieran said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "I will not bind myself to an Omega who brings nothing to this pack." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Alara felt the words like physical blows, each one landing with precision. She tried to speak, tried to ask what he meant, but her throat had closed up with shock and rising panic. "You are kind," Kieran continued, his tone almost conversational, as if they were discussing the weather rather than destroying her entire world. "You are gentle and caring, and all the soft qualities that Omegas are praised for. But I am heir to the Silvercrest pack, Alara. When my father steps down, I will lead thousands of wolves, defend vast territories, make decisions that determine whether our pack survives or falls. And I need a Luna who can stand beside me in that. Someone with political connections, someone with power of their own, someone who can be an asset rather than a liability." The cruelty of his words was made worse by their calm delivery. He wasn't angry, wasn't emotional. He was simply stating facts as he saw them, explaining his reasoning as if that would somehow soften the blow. Alara's mother made a sound from somewhere in the crowd, a broken sob that made Alara's chest tighten even further. "But what about the mate bond?" Alara managed to whisper. "The moon goddess chose us for each other. You can feel it just as I can." Kieran's expression didn't change. "The moon goddess also gave us free will, and I choose not to accept a bond that would weaken my position. You deserve someone who will value your gentleness, Alara. You deserve a quiet life with a mate who wants the softness you offer. But that mate is not me. I need someone harder, someone stronger, someone who understands that leading a pack requires sacrifices that you would never be willing to make. He took a breath, and Alara knew what was coming next. She could feel it building through the bond, could sense the exact moment when he made his final decision. No, she breathed, taking a step back. Kieran, please don't do this. We can work something out. I can learn. I can become what you need. I can change. But even as she said it, she knew it was useless. She could see it in his eyes, in the set of his shoulders, in the way he stood before her like a judge passing sentence. He'd already made up his mind probably weeks ago, and nothing she could say would change it now. I, Kieran Blackthorn, heir to the Silver Crest Pack, reject you, Alara Moonwhisper, as my mate and my Luna. The formal words echoed through the hall, heavy with power and finality. Alara felt the mate bond begin to tear, felt it ripping apart inside her chest like someone was pulling her heart out through her ribs. She gasped, doubling over from the pain, and heard her mother cry out again. But the worst part wasn't the physical agony. It was the emotional devastation. The absolute certainty that she had been weighed and measured and found wanting by the one person who was supposed to value her above all others. The bond snapped completely, leaving a gaping wound where it had been. Alara fell to her knees, unable to stand through the wave of pain that crashed over her. She was vaguely aware of people rushing forward, of her mother's arms around her, of voices raised in shock and anger and pity. But all she could focus on was Kieran, standing there unmoved and untouched, watching her suffer without a flicker of remorse. You'll find someone better, he said, and the kindness in his tone was somehow worse than cruelty would have been. Someone who wants the kind of mate you'll be. But that person isn't me, Alara. It never could have been me. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the suddenly chaotic hall. He didn't look back, didn't pause, didn't show any sign that he'd just destroyed a woman who had loved him with her whole heart. He simply left, leaving Alara kneeling in her white bonding dress, surrounded by the shattered remains of her future. The days that followed were a blur of pain and humiliation. The physical symptoms of a severed mate bond were brutal: fever and chills, muscle aches, a constant burning sensation in her chest where the bond had been torn away. But the emotional damage was worse. Every time Alara closed her eyes, she saw Kieran's face, heard his words, felt the dismissal in his gaze. You bring nothing to this pack. You are a liability. You are too soft, too weak, too fundamentally insufficient. Her mother tried to help, brought her meals she couldn't eat, sat with her through the long nights when the pain was too intense for sleep. Your father would have challenged him for this dishonor, her mother said one evening, her voice tight with anger. If he were still alive, Kieran Blackthorn would be answering for what he did to you. But Alara's father had died 3 years earlier, and without an alpha to defend her honor, there was nothing to be done. Pack law allowed rejection, even encouraged it if a mate was deemed unsuitable. Kieran had followed every protocol perfectly, had done nothing technically wrong. He'd just been honest about not wanting her. The pack's reaction was mixed. Some wolves looked at Alara with pity, others with the kind of awkward discomfort people show around grief they don't know how to handle. A few, mostly the more traditional wolves who valued strength above all else, seemed to agree with Kieran's assessment. An Omega Luna would have been unusual, they whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. Perhaps it's better this way. Perhaps he was right to choose duty over sentiment, Alara tried to return to her normal life, tried to resume her work at the pack school where she taught young pups their history and traditions. But everything had changed. The children looked at her differently now, with the kind of careful kindness people show to broken things. The other teachers didn't know what to say to her, hovering between sympathy and the desire to pretend nothing had happened. And every day she had to watch Kieran from a distance, had to see him going about his duties as heir apparent, apparently unaffected by what he'd done. 2 weeks after the rejection, Kieran announced his engagement to Seraphina Nightshade, daughter of the Alpha of the Darkwater Pack. The news spread through Silvercrest like wildfire. Seraphina was everything Alara wasn't. A powerful alpha female with political connections, combat training, and a reputation for ruthless efficiency. She was beautiful and dangerous, and exactly what Kieran had said he needed. The bonding ceremony was scheduled for 3 months away, and Alara knew she couldn't stay to witness it. "I have to leave," she told her mother one morning, her voice hollow but certain. "I can't stay here and watch him build the life he rejected me for. Every day I stay is another day of humiliation, another reminder that I wasn't good enough. I need to go somewhere new, somewhere that doesn't know about my failure." Her mother's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded understanding. "Where will you go?" "I don't know yet. Somewhere far from Silvercrest, far from the Northern Territories, maybe the Eastern Packs, or the Southern Territories. Somewhere I can start over and figure out who I'm supposed to be without him." The decision should have been harder, should have required more thought, but Alara had spent 2 weeks feeling like a ghost in her own pack, and she knew that staying would only prolong the agony. So she packed her belongings, said goodbye to her mother and the few friends who still looked at her without pity, and left Silvercrest before dawn, on a cold autumn morning. She had no destination in mind, no plan beyond putting as much distance as possible between herself and the pack that had witnessed her humiliation. She traveled south through neutral territories, avoiding packlands when she could, offering respectful greetings when she couldn't. Most packs let her pass without incident once they scented that she was alone and unmated, no threat and no value. A rejected Omega on her own was barely worth acknowledging. The loneliness was crushing. Alara had spent her entire life surrounded by pack, had never been truly alone before. Now she walked for days without seeing another soul, slept in caves or under trees, survived on whatever she could forage or hunt in her wolf form. The physical hardship was nothing compared to the emotional emptiness, the constant awareness that she had no bond, no pack, no purpose. She was adrift in every way that mattered, a wolf without a home, an Omega without a mate, a teacher without students to guide. 3 weeks into her journey, exhausted and half-starved, Alara stumbled into the territory of the Iron Moon Pack. She hadn't meant to cross their borders, had been too focused on just keeping moving to pay attention to territorial markers. But suddenly, she was surrounded by patrol wolves, their eyes suspicious, and their postures aggressive. "State your business," the lead wolf demanded, a large male with scars across his muzzle. "You're trespassing on Iron Moon land." "I'm sorry," Alara managed, swaying on her feet from exhaustion. "I didn't realize. I'm just passing through. I'll leave immediately." The wolf's expression softened slightly as he took in her condition. "You're in no shape to go anywhere. When's the last time you ate?" Alara tried to remember and couldn't. Days ago, maybe. "I've been traveling for a while." The patrol wolves exchanged glances, and the leader made a decision. "Come with us. Our Luna will want to meet you, determine whether you're a threat. If you're cleared, we'll give you food and a place to rest, before you continue your journey." It was the kindness in his voice that broke through Alara's defenses. She'd been treated with pity or dismissal for so long that simple, straightforward kindness felt like a shock to her system. She nodded mutely and followed the patrol deeper into Iron Moon territory. The Iron Moon Pack compound was different from Silvercrest, smaller but somehow warmer, with buildings that looked lived in rather than impressive. The patrol led her to a central meeting hall where a woman waited, tall and powerful with silver-streaked dark hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. This was Luna Marina, and even without being told, Ilara would have known she was looking at someone extraordinary. Marina studied Ilara for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she dismissed the patrol with a gesture and moved closer. "You're rejected," she said quietly. "I can sense it on you, the broken bond, the pain you're carrying." "How long ago?" 3 weeks, Ilara whispered, unable to meet the Luna's eyes. "I left my pack rather than watch my former mate bond with someone else." Marina's expression shifted to something that looked like understanding and anger combined. "Who was the fool who rejected you?" "Kieran Blackthorn, heir to the Silvercrest pack. He said I wasn't strong enough to be his Luna, that I would be a liability rather than an asset. He said he needed someone with power and political connections, someone who could help him lead. And you believed him," Marina said. "But it wasn't a question. You internalized his rejection, made it about your worth, rather than his blindness." Ilara finally looked up, surprised by the sharpness in the Luna's voice. "But he was right. I don't have power. I'm just a teacher. I don't know anything about politics or combat or any of the things a Luna needs to know. What I was wouldn't have been enough for him." "What you were," Marina corrected gently, "was exactly what you were supposed to be before someone told you it wasn't valuable. Tell me, Ilara, what did you do in your pack before the rejection?" "I taught at the pack school. History, traditions, languages. I helped young pups understand where they came from and what it means to be part of a pack. So you preserved culture and educated the next generation." Marina's voice carried an edge now. "You passed down knowledge that would otherwise be lost, helped shape young minds, ensured that your pack's identity continued. And Kieran Blackthorn looked at that and decided it wasn't valuable. That says more about his limited vision than it does about your worth." The words hit Ilara like a revelation. She'd spent 3 weeks believing Kieran's assessment of her, accepting his judgment as truth. But hearing someone else, someone powerful and respected, suggest that maybe the problem was his inability to see value rather than her lack of it. Something shifted inside her chest. Before she could respond, the door to the meeting hall opened, and a man entered. Alara's breath caught, because even without being told, she knew she was looking at the Iron Moon Alpha. He was tall and powerfully built with dark hair and eyes that gleamed gold in the firelight. But what struck her most was the way he moved, the absolute confidence in every step, the presence that filled the room without him saying a word. "Darius," Marina said warmly, "come meet our guest. This is Ilara Moonwhisper, recently rejected by Kieran Blackthorn of Silvercrest. She's been traveling alone and needs rest and food." The Alpha's eyes found Ilara, and she felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. Something passed across his face too quickly for her to identify. Then he crossed the room and bowed slightly, a gesture of respect that made her blink in surprise. "Welcome to Iron Moon territory," he said, his voice deep and controlled. "You're safe here for as long as you need. No wolf who has been treated dishonorably deserves to be turned away." Marina's lips curved into a slight smile. Darius has particular feelings about rejected mates. His sister was rejected 5 years ago, and he's never forgiven the alpha who did it. Tends to make him protective of others in similar situations. Darius shot his mother a look that suggested she was revealing more than he wanted shared, but he didn't deny it. Rejection is a coward's way out, he said firmly. If a mate bond forms, it forms for a reason. Walking away from it because someone doesn't fit your political aspirations is an insult to the moon goddess herself. Alara felt tears prick at her eyes. After weeks of believing she deserved her rejection, hearing an alpha call Kieran a coward was almost overwhelming. I don't want to impose, she managed. If I could just rest for a day or two, I'll continue on. Where exactly were you planning to go? Marina asked gently. Alara hesitated. I don't know. Somewhere far from the Northern Territories. Somewhere I can start over. Then stay here, Darius said, and there was command in his voice, but also invitation. Stay in Iron Moon. We have need of a teacher for our pack school. The current one is elderly and wants to retire. If you're qualified to teach history and traditions, you'd be doing us a service by accepting the position. It was too much, too generous. Alara shook her head. I couldn't possibly. You don't know me. You don't know if I'm any good at teaching or if I'd fit in here. Why would you offer this to a stranger? Because you're not a stranger, Marina said softly. You're a rejected Omega who needs a chance to rebuild. And we're a pack that believes in second chances, in recognizing value that others are too blind to see. Stay for 1 month. If you hate it, we'll help you continue your journey. But give us a chance to show you what your life could be like without someone telling you you're not enough. Alara looked between the Luna and the Alpha, seeing nothing but sincerity in their expressions. They were offering her something she hadn't even dared to hope for. A home, a purpose, a chance to be valued again. And standing there in that warm meeting hall, exhausted and broken but not quite defeated, she made a decision that would change everything. 1 month, she agreed quietly. I'll stay for 1 month and teach. After that, we'll see. Marina's smile was radiant. You won't regret this, I promise. Darius, why don't you show Alara to the guest quarters while I have food prepared? She needs rest and proper care. As Darius led her through the compound, Alara tried to process what had just happened. An hour ago, she'd been a trespasser facing potential punishment. Now she was being offered a home and a job by wolves who barely knew her. It felt surreal, impossible. But when they reached the guest quarters, a small but comfortable space with a real bed and windows that looked out over the forest, reality started to sink in. Rest, Darius said from the doorway. I'll have someone bring you food and clean clothes. Tomorrow, if you're feeling strong enough, my mother will show you the pack school and introduce you to the students. Alara nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. But before Darius could leave, she found her voice. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. For all you know, I could be a terrible teacher or a troublemaker or someone who actually deserved rejection. Darius turned back, his golden eyes intense on her face. I know rejection when I see it. I know what it looks like when someone has internalized lies about their worth. And I know that Kieran Blackthorne is building a reputation as a ruthless political operator who values power over everything else. If he rejected you for being too kind, too gentle, too focused on education and culture, then he's an idiot. And we'd be idiots to turn away someone with your qualities just because he couldn't see their value. He left before Alara could respond, and she stood alone in her new quarters, trying to absorb the kindness she'd just been shown. For the first time in 3 weeks, the crushing weight of her rejection eased slightly. Maybe, just maybe, There was life after Kieran Blackthorn. Maybe being rejected by him didn't mean she was worthless. Maybe it just meant she'd been with the wrong pack, valued for the wrong things, judged by standards that were never meant to apply to her. That night, as Alara fell asleep in a real bed for the first time since leaving Silvercrest, she dreamed not of Kieran's cold dismissal, but of possibility, of a future where she could be exactly who she was without apology, where her gentleness was strength rather than weakness, where teaching and preserving culture mattered as much as political maneuvering and combat prowess. She couldn't have known then that staying in Iron Moon would lead to everything she'd lost, and more. She couldn't have imagined that the alpha who'd shown her kindness would become something far more important than a generous host, and she definitely couldn't have predicted that 3 years later, Kieran Blackthorn would walk into a summit meeting and see her sitting beside Darius, wearing the title of Luna, radiating power and confidence that made his confident Seraphina look ordinary by comparison. But that revelation was still 3 years away. For now, Alara slept peacefully for the first time since her rejection, surrounded by wolves who saw value where Kieran had seen only liability, protected by a pack that believed in second chances, and beginning the long journey from broken Omega to something far more extraordinary than anyone, including herself, could have imagined. The month Ilara had agreed to stay stretched into 2, then 3, then 6. The pack school became her sanctuary, a place where her knowledge and gentleness were valued rather than dismissed. The young pups adored her, responding to her teaching methods with enthusiasm that their previous teacher had never inspired. She taught them the old languages, the traditional songs, the history of their pack, and the greater wolf world. She helped them understand not just what it meant to be Iron Moon wolves, but what it meant to be part of something larger, a culture that stretched back millennia. Marina visited often, sitting in on lessons and offering quiet encouragement. "Your teaching style is remarkable," she told Alara one afternoon after watching her lead a class on pack diplomacy. "You make complex political concepts accessible to pups who would normally be bored by such topics. You have a gift for education that goes beyond simple knowledge transfer." The praise made Alara uncomfortable at first. She'd spent so long believing she had nothing valuable to offer that accepting compliments felt foreign, almost wrong. But slowly, week by week, the positive reinforcement began to sink in. The pups learned, their parents praised her work, and even the pack's warriors would stop by to ask questions about historical battles or traditional combat techniques that had been documented in the old texts she studied. Darius was a constant but respectful presence. He would attend major lessons, ask thoughtful questions, and show genuine interest in the cultural preservation work Ilara was doing. But he never pushed for more than professional interaction, never made her uncomfortable with unwanted attention. He was simply there, a steady support that Alara found herself relying on more than she wanted to admit. 6 months after her arrival, Mirena called Alara to her private quarters. "I have a proposition," the Luna said without preamble. "The council has been discussing your position here, and we'd like to make it permanent, not just as a teacher, but as Iron Moon's official cultural keeper. It's a position we haven't had filled in decades, but watching your work has reminded us how important it is to preserve our traditions and history." Alara felt her chest tighten with emotion. A cultural keeper was a position of significant status in traditional packs, someone who advised the alpha on matters of tradition, who preserved knowledge, who ensured that pack identity remained strong across generations. It was far more than just teaching. It was being entrusted with the pack's very soul. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "This is more than I ever imagined." "Say yes," Marina replied with a gentle smile. "Say you'll stay and help us preserve what makes Iron Moon special. Say you'll accept that you have value here, that what you offer matters." The words hit hard because they touched on the central struggle Ilara had been fighting since her rejection. Did she have value? Could she accept that Kieran had been wrong, that her gentleness and cultural knowledge were strengths rather than weaknesses? Looking at Marina's sincere expression, feeling the warmth of acceptance that Iron Moon had shown her for 6 months, Ilara made her choice. "Yes," she said firmly, "I'll stay. I'll be your cultural keeper, and I'll do everything I can to honor the trust you're placing in me." The official ceremony appointing her to the position happened 2 weeks later. The entire pack gathered to witness as Alpha Darius formally named her cultural keeper, placing around her neck the traditional silver pendant that marked the position. As she stood before hundreds of wolves who looked at her with respect rather than pity, Ilara felt something shift fundamentally inside her. She wasn't broken. She never had been. She'd just been in the wrong place, judged by the wrong standards, valued for things that had nothing to do with her actual worth. Here in Iron Moon, surrounded by wolves who understood that preserving culture and educating the next generation mattered as much as political alliances and combat prowess, she could finally breathe. After the ceremony, Darius approached her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You've brought something back to this pack that we'd lost," he said quietly. "A connection to our history, a respect for tradition that had been fading. Thank you for staying, for giving us a chance to show you what we saw in you from the beginning." "What did you see?" Ilara asked, genuinely curious. "Because I'm still not entirely sure why you helped me that first day." Darius was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I saw someone who'd been told she wasn't enough by someone too blind to recognize value. I saw strength disguised as gentleness, intelligence disguised as simplicity, power disguised as softness. And I knew that if we could convince you to stay, you'd prove that Kieran Blackthorn was an idiot." The mention of Kieran's name still stung, but not as sharply as it once had. Ilara had spent 6 months building a new life, establishing herself in a role that mattered, surrounded by wolves who valued her. The wound of rejection was still there, but it was healing, scarring over into something that made her stronger rather than breaking her apart. As autumn turned to winter, and then to spring, Ilara settled deeper into her role as cultural keeper. She established a formal archive of pack history, interviewed elders to record their stories before their knowledge was lost, taught advanced classes on diplomacy and tradition to wolves, training for leadership positions. She became someone the pack relied on, someone whose opinion mattered, someone who shaped Iron Moon's identity in ways both subtle and profound. And through it all, Darius was there, not intruding, not demanding, just present. They would talk after council meetings about how to balance tradition with innovation. They would debate pack policy and historical precedent. They would sit in comfortable silence in the archive while Ilara cataloged old documents and Darius worked on territory maps. A friendship developed between them, built on mutual respect and shared values. And Ilara found herself looking forward to their interactions in ways that both excited and terrified her. She'd been rejected once already. She'd learned the hard way that bonds could be broken, that love wasn't enough, that someone could look at her and decide she wasn't worthy. The idea of opening herself up to that possibility again felt like inviting devastation. So she kept things professional, friendly but bounded, refusing to acknowledge the growing warmth in her chest whenever Darius smiled at her. or the way her heart raced when their hands accidentally touched over shared documents. But Marina saw it. One evening, nearly a year after Ilara's arrival, the Luna invited her for tea in her private quarters. "You're afraid," Marina said without preamble once they were settled. "Afraid of what's growing between you and my son." Ilara nearly dropped her cup. "I don't know what you mean. We're friends and colleagues, nothing more." Marina's expression was knowing but kind. "Ilara, I've lived long enough to recognize a mate bond forming. I see the way you look at each other, the way you orbit each other without even realizing it. My son hasn't looked at anyone the way he looks at you, and you light up when he's near even as you try to hide it. Why are you fighting this?" "Because I've been rejected before," Ilara said, the words bursting out before she could stop them. "Because I know what it feels like to believe in a bond and have it torn away. Because I can't survive that kind of pain again. What if I let myself feel this and Darius decides I'm not enough? What if history repeats itself?" Marina set down her cup and moved closer, taking Ilara's hands in hers. "My son is not Kieran Blackthorn. He doesn't value power over character, political advantage over genuine connection. He's been waiting his entire life for his true mate, and now that he's found her, he's terrified of pushing too hard and scaring you away. You're both dancing around each other, both afraid of being hurt. But Ilara, true mate bonds don't come along often. If you let fear rob you of this chance, you'll regret it for the rest of your life." The words hit home because Ilara knew they were true. She'd been so focused on protecting herself from potential pain that she'd been blind to what was right in front of her. Darius had shown her nothing but respect, kindness, support. He'd given her space to heal, time to rebuild, freedom to become who she was meant to be. And now, a year later, she was stronger, more confident, more certain of her worth. Maybe it was time to be brave enough to take the risk. That night, Ilara couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Marina's words, about the possibility of a true mate bond, about Darius and the way he made her feel seen and valued in ways Kieran never had. Around midnight, unable to stand the racing thoughts any longer, she threw on a cloak and headed to the archive, where she did her best thinking. She wasn't surprised to find Darius already there, sitting at one of the research tables with documents spread before him. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression suggested he'd been expecting her or hoping for her arrival. "Couldn't sleep either," he said quietly. "I've been trying to focus on border agreements, but my mind keeps wandering." Ilara moved closer, her heart pounding. "Your mother talked to me tonight, about us, about what she thinks is happening between us." Darius went very still. "And what do you think is happening between us?" "I think," Ilara said slowly, carefully, "that I've been so afraid of being hurt again, that I've been blind to something that could be extraordinary. I think you've been patient with me in ways I didn't deserve, giving me space and time when you could have demanded answers. I think I'm tired of being afraid." She took a deep breath. "I think I'm falling in love with you, Darius, and I think that terrifies me almost as much as it makes me happy." Darius stood, crossing to her in 3 strides. His hands came up to frame her face, gentle but certain. "I've been in love with you since the day you stood up to your fears and came to find me in this archive," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been in love with you since you challenged my assessment of a historical treaty and proved me wrong with documentation I'd never seen. I've been in love with you since I watched you teach a class on pact diplomacy and realized you understand politics better than most of my council. I've been in love with you since the moment I understood that Kieran Blackthorn's greatest mistake was letting you walk away." Alara felt tears streaming down her face, but they were good tears this time. Healing tears. "I'm still scared," she admitted. "I'm still afraid of not being enough." "Then we'll be scared together," Darius said, echoing words she'd once heard in a different context. "But Alara, I need you to understand something. You are my true mate. Not a political convenience, not a strategic alliance, not a backup option. The moon goddess chose you for me, and every day I spend with you confirms that she knew exactly what she was doing. You are enough. You have always been enough, and if you'll let me, I'll spend the rest of my life proving it to you." When he kissed her, the mate bond that had been forming slowly over months suddenly blazed into full existence. It was nothing like what Alara had felt with Kieran, that pale imitation that had been so easily broken. This was fire and certainty and completion, a connection so deep and fundamental that she wondered how she'd survived without it. This was what a true mate bond felt like, and it was extraordinary. They stood there in the archive, wrapped in each other's arms while the bond settled between them, warm and permanent, and absolutely right. And for the first time since her rejection, Alara felt whole, not because a mate completed her, but because she'd found someone who saw her completely and loved what he saw, who valued her strengths without trying to change her softness, who understood that being gentle didn't mean being weak. "I want to accept the bond," Alara whispered against his chest. "I want to be your mate, your Luna, your partner in everything. But Darius, I need you to understand that I'm still healing. I'm still learning to trust again. I need time to adjust to this, to believe it's real." Darius pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "Take all the time you need. We can announce the bond when you're ready. We can have a formal ceremony when you feel prepared. There's no rush, Alara. I've waited my entire life for you. I can wait a little longer for you to be certain." The formal announcement came 3 months later, after Alara had spent time adjusting to the bond, learning to trust its permanence, convincing herself that Darius truly meant every word he'd said. The Iron Moon Pack celebrated with genuine joy. Their alpha finally mated to someone who clearly made him happy. Their cultural keeper elevated to the position of Luna. But there was one detail that Alara insisted on. She wanted to wait a full year before having a mating ceremony, wanted time to fully step into her role as Luna, to prove to herself and everyone else that she was capable of the position. Darius agreed without hesitation, understanding her need to establish herself before making everything official. That year was transformative. Alara discovered that being Luna suited her in ways she'd never imagined. Her cultural knowledge became invaluable in diplomatic negotiations. Her gentleness made her approachable to pack members with concerns. Her teaching background helped her mediate disputes and find compromises. She wasn't the kind of Luna who led through physical dominance or political maneuvering. She led through wisdom, compassion, and deep understanding of what made a pack strong. And slowly, word began to spread through the northern territories about the Iron Moon Luna, who was unlike any other. Alphas who visited for diplomatic meetings left impressed by her knowledge and insight. Omegas from other packs would request visits just to meet the Luna who proved that gentleness could be power. The Iron Moon Pack itself flourished under her and Darius's combined leadership, their territory expanding, their influence growing, their reputation for fairness and strength attracting wolves from other packs who wanted to join. 2 years after Alara's arrival in Iron Moon, Darius's father stepped down, and Darius officially became Alpha, with Alara as his Luna. The ceremony was attended by representatives from every major pack in the Northern Territories. Alara stood beside Darius in traditional Luna regalia, the silver pendant of cultural keeper still around her neck alongside her Luna marks, and accepted the formal oaths of loyalty from their pack. She was no longer the rejected Omega who'd stumbled into Iron Moon territory exhausted and broken. She was Luna Alara, respected and valued, powerful in her own right. But the invitation that arrived 6 months later changed everything. The Northern Territories Council was calling for a summit, a gathering of all major packs to discuss territorial disputes and trade agreements. Attendance was mandatory for all alphas and their lunas, which meant Alara would be seeing Kieran Blackthorn for the first time in 3 years. The news sent ice through Alara's veins. She'd built a new life, healed from her rejection, found her true mate and her true purpose. But the idea of facing Kieran again, of seeing the man who'd publicly declared her worthless, brought back echoes of old pain. What if seeing him undid all her healing? What if those old wounds tore open? What if she proved unable to maintain her composure and embarrassed Darius and Iron Moon? Darius found her in the archive that evening, staring at the summit invitation without really seeing it. "You're afraid of seeing him again," he said quietly, settling into the chair beside her. Alara nodded, unable to deny it. 3 years should have been enough time to move past this. I shouldn't still care what he thinks or how he reacts to seeing me. But the idea of walking into that summit hall and facing him, I feel like that broken Omega again, kneeling in her bonding dress while everyone watches her fail. Darius took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "You're not that Omega anymore. You're my Luna, my mate, my equal partner in leading one of the most respected packs in the territories. You've accomplished more in 3 years than most wolves do in a lifetime. Kieran's opinion of you hasn't mattered for a long time, Alara. The only opinion that matters is your own. And what do you think when you look at yourself now?" Alara considered the question seriously. What did she see when she looked at herself? Not the soft, gentle teacher that Kieran had dismissed. She saw someone who'd survived devastating rejection and come out stronger. Someone who'd built a cultural preservation program that other packs were now trying to replicate. Someone who'd helped negotiate 3 major territorial agreements using historical precedent and diplomatic skill. Someone who'd earned the respect of wolves who would have dismissed her 3 years ago. Someone who'd proven that there were many kinds of strength, and hers was no less valuable than combat prowess or political maneuvering. "I think I'm exactly who I was always meant to be," Alara said slowly. "I think Kieran rejecting me was the moon goddess pushing me toward my real destiny. And I think I'm actually grateful it happened, because if he'd accepted me, I'd be living a half-life in Silvercrest, trying to be someone I'm not. Instead, I'm here with you, doing work that matters, leading wolves who value what I offer. I think I'm stronger than I ever imagined I could be." Darius smiled, and it was full of pride and love. "Then that's what Kieran will see when we walk into that summit. Not the Omega he rejected, but the Luna who became everything she was meant to be without him. Let him choke on his regret, Alara. You've already won." The summit was held at neutral ground, a massive lodge built specifically for interpack gatherings. When Darius and Alara arrived with their delegation, the parking area was already filled with vehicles from other packs. Alara's heart hammered as they approached the main entrance, knowing that somewhere inside, Kieran was waiting. She'd dressed carefully that morning in traditional Luna regalia that honored both her position and her cultural keeper role. Her silver pendant gleamed against the deep blue of her formal dress, and the Luna marks on her neck were visible and unmistakable. She looked like what she was, powerful, confident, undeniably important. The summit hall was enormous, with a circular table arrangement that allowed all packs to see each other. Alphas and Lunas were already taking their positions, greeting each other with varying degrees of warmth or wariness. Alara scanned the room, her breath catching when she spotted Kieran on the opposite side of the circle. He was talking to another Alpha, his posture relaxed and confident, and beside him stood Seraphina, beautiful and fierce, every inch the powerful Luna he'd said he needed. But then Kieran looked up, and his gaze found Alara across the crowded room. She watched his expression shift from casual interest to shock, to something that might have been recognition or disbelief. His mouth actually fell open slightly, and Seraphina followed his stare, her eyes narrowing as she assessed Alara with obvious calculation. For a long moment, the three of them simply stared at each other across the distance. Then Darius's hand settled on the small of Alara's back, a gentle reminder of his presence and support, and Alara lifted her chin and looked away from Kieran, as if he was no more important than any other Alpha in the room. The official summit opening involved formal introductions of all attending packs. When it was Iron Moon's turn, Darius stood with easy confidence. "Alpha Darius of the Iron Moon Pack," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "And my Luna and mate, Alara Moonwhisper, who also serves as our cultural keeper and diplomatic advisor. She has been instrumental in our recent territorial negotiations and trade agreements, and I'm honored to have her wisdom in our leadership." The introduction was met with polite applause and nods of respect from Alphas who'd worked with Alara over the past 2 years. But Alara was watching Kieran, and she saw the exact moment when understanding crashed over him. She wasn't just some Omega who'd found a new pack after his rejection. She was the Luna of Iron Moon, one of the rising powers in the Northern Territories. She was mated to an Alpha whose influence was growing rapidly. She was someone who mattered, someone with real power and status. Everything he'd said she didn't have, she'd found. Everything he'd claimed she couldn't be, she'd become, and she'd done it all without him. The first day of the summit was devoted to territorial disputes. Alara participated actively, using her knowledge of historical boundaries and traditional claims to help resolve conflicts that had seemed intractable. Alphas, who'd been ready to go to war over border disagreements, found themselves accepting her proposed compromises, impressed by her depth of knowledge and her ability to find solutions that honored everyone's needs. By the lunch break, she'd mediated 3 separate disputes successfully, and even wolves from packs she'd never worked with before were approaching Darius to compliment him on his Luna's diplomatic skills. Kieran watched all of this from across the room, his expression growing darker with each successful mediation. During the lunch break, Alara was discussing a cultural preservation initiative with several other Lunas when she felt someone approach from behind. She turned to find Kieran standing there, Seraphina a few steps back with her arms crossed and her expression neutral. "Alara," Kieran said, and there was something in his voice she couldn't quite identify. "It's been a long time." 3 years, Alara replied calmly, though her heart was racing. She was acutely aware of the other Lunas watching this interaction with obvious interest, of Darius across the room turning toward them, of the weight of this moment. "You're Luna of Iron Moon now," Kieran continued, and it almost sounded like an accusation. "Cultural keeper and diplomatic advisor. That's quite the rise for someone who left Silvercrest with nothing." Alara felt anger spike through her, but she kept her voice level and professional. "I didn't leave with nothing, Kieran. I left with everything that mattered. My knowledge, my skills, my values, my strength. I just had to find a pack that recognized the value in those things. Iron Moon saw what you were, too, blind to see. One of the other Lunas, a sharp-eyed woman named Cassandra from the Nightfall pack, spoke up with barely concealed amusement. Wait, is this the Alpha who rejected you? The one from the stories we've all heard? Alara, I had no idea it was Kieran Blackthorn. How deliciously awkward for him. Kieran's face flushed with anger or embarrassment. Stories? What stories? Oh, the stories about the fool Alpha who rejected his true mate because she wasn't politically connected enough, Cassandra said sweetly. The ones about how that rejected Omega went on to become one of the most respected Lunas in the territories, while his own pack has been struggling with internal conflicts and failed diplomatic initiatives. Those stories, they're quite popular in certain circles. Alara watched Kieran's expression shift as he realized that his rejection of her had become a cautionary tale, a story about the dangers of valuing status over substance. That's not, he started, but Cassandra cut him off. Not accurate? Please. Everyone knows Silvercrest has lost 3 major trade agreements in the past 2 years because your Luna, she glanced at Serafina, no offense intended, lacks the diplomatic finesse required for complex negotiations. Meanwhile, Iron Moon has been securing alliance after alliance, largely due to Luna Alara's cultural knowledge and mediation skills. The contrast is rather stark. Serafina stepped forward, her eyes flashing with anger. Careful how you speak about Silvercrest. Nightfall. We're still one of the largest packs in the territories. Size isn't everything, another Luna chimed in, clearly enjoying the drama. Iron Moon is half your size, but twice as influential right now, and we all know it's because Alpha Darius had the wisdom to value his Luna's gifts rather than dismissing them as weaknesses. The conversation was spiraling into exactly the kind of public spectacle Ilara had hoped to avoid. She held up her hand, and the other Lunas fell silent, clearly respecting her enough to let her speak. Kieran, she said quietly but firmly, whatever happened between us is in the past. I'm not interested in rehashing old wounds or turning this summit into a referendum on your choices. You made your decision 3 years ago, and I've built a life I'm proud of. That's all that needs to be said. Kieran stared at her, and something cracked in his carefully controlled expression. You should have told me, he said, his voice low and intense. You should have told me you had all these skills, this knowledge, this potential for diplomacy. If I'd known what you were capable of, if you'd shown me this side of yourself, I might have made a different choice. The words hung in the air, shocking in their implications. Ilara felt Darius arrive at her side, his presence solid and supportive, but she didn't need him to fight this battle. She'd already won it. You had 3 years to see what I was capable of, Kieran, she said, her voice steady, despite the emotions churning in her chest. 3 years of watching me teach, of seeing me work with young wolves, of witnessing my dedication to preserving culture and tradition. But you never really looked, did you? You made assumptions based on what an Omega should be, rather than seeing who I actually was. And when I didn't fit your narrow definition of valuable, you rejected me without ever bothering to discover my depths. She took a breath, feeling strength flowing through her from the mate bond with Darius, from her own hard-won confidence, from the knowledge of everything she'd accomplished. I didn't develop these skills after you rejected me, Kieran. I always had them. I was always capable of this kind of work. The only thing that changed was that I found a pack and a mate who recognized my value and gave me opportunities to show what I could do. Darius didn't need me to prove myself before accepting me. He saw my potential and believed in it. That's the difference between a leader who understands true strength and one who only recognizes power when it's performed in ways he expects. Kieran looked like she'd struck him physically. His face had gone pale, and there was something in his eyes that might have been regret or realization, or both. But before he could respond, Serafina spoke up, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "You rejected her 3 years ago, Kieran. She moved on, built a new life, found her true mate. Why are you acting like you have any claim to her now? Why do you even care?" The question hung in the air, and Alara saw Kieran struggle to answer it. The truth was written all over his face. He cared because he'd made a mistake. He cared because he'd let something valuable slip through his fingers. He cared because watching Alara succeed, seeing her shine in ways he'd never allowed her to shine in Silvercrest, forced him to confront the fact that his rejection hadn't been about her inadequacies at all. It had been about his own limited vision, his own inability to see value in forms that didn't match his expectations. "This is my mate you're talking about," Darius said, his voice carrying quiet authority that made several nearby wolves turn toward them. "My Luna, my partner, my equal. And I'll thank you to remember that whatever history you have with her is irrelevant now. She chose me, chose Iron Moon, chose a life where she's valued for exactly who she is. Your regret doesn't change that. Your belated recognition of her worth doesn't earn you any claim to her. She was never yours, Kieran, and she never will be." The words were delivered without heat, but with absolute finality. Kieran stepped back as if physically pushed, his expression a mixture of shock and growing despair. "Alara," he started one more time, but she shook her head. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. You made your choice. I've made mine. We both have to live with the consequences of those choices. I wish you well, Kieran. I hope Silvercrest prospers and that you and Serafina find happiness together. But I'm done letting your rejection define any part of my life. I've moved on. You should too." She turned away from him then, linking her arm through Darius's and walking back toward the Iron Moon delegation without a backward glance. Behind her, she heard the murmur of conversation as the other Lunas dispersed, no doubt already spreading the story of the confrontation to their packs. But Alara didn't care about gossip or speculation. She cared about the fact that she'd faced her greatest fear and come through it stronger than ever. She'd looked Kieran in the eye and felt nothing but pity for the Alpha, who'd been too blind to recognize what he had. That evening, after the formal summit sessions had concluded, Darius found Alara on the balcony of their suite, looking out over the forest. "You were magnificent today," he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "The way you handled Kieran, the grace you showed even when he was clearly trying to get a reaction. I've never been more proud to call you my Luna." Alara leaned back against him, feeling the mate bond hum contentedly between them. "I kept waiting to feel something when I saw him, pain or anger or even satisfaction at how far I've come. But all I felt was relief that he rejected me, because if he hadn't, I'd never have found you. I'd never have discovered what I'm capable of. I'd be living a half-life, trying to be someone I'm not, forever wondering if I was enough." "You've always been enough," Darius murmured against her hair. The only person who couldn't see it was Kieran. "But his loss was my gain, and I'll never take for granted the gift the moon goddess gave me when she brought you to Iron Moon." Alara turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd seen her value when she couldn't see it herself, who'd given her space to heal and time to grow, who'd loved her not despite her gentleness, but because of it. "I love you," she said simply. "Thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. Thank you for showing me that there are many kinds of strength, and mine is just as valuable as any other." Darius kissed her softly, the mate bond blazing bright between them. "I love you too," he said, "and tomorrow, when we go back into that summit, you're going to continue being the extraordinary Luna you are. You're going to negotiate agreements and preserve traditions and show every alpha in that room why Iron Moon is a force to be reckoned with. And Kieran is going to watch it all and realize exactly what he lost." The rest of the summit passed in a blur of successful negotiations and growing respect from the other packs. Alara mediated a complex territorial dispute between 3 different packs that had been feuding for decades, using historical documents and traditional law to find a compromise that satisfied everyone. She helped establish a new interpack cultural exchange program that would allow young wolves to learn traditions from different territories. She gave a presentation on preserving pack histories that had alphas and lunas from across the territories requesting copies of her methodologies. And through it all, Kieran watched from across the room, his expression growing more haunted with each passing day. Alara would catch him staring sometimes, would see the regret written clearly on his face, and feel nothing but distant pity. He'd made his choice based on what he thought a Luna should be, and now he was paying the price for that limited vision. Meanwhile, Serafina was clearly struggling with her role, her combat-oriented mind unsuited for the complex diplomatic negotiations that dominated summit discussions. She was powerful and fierce, exactly what Kieran had said he needed, but she lacked the cultural knowledge, the historical understanding, the gentle diplomatic touch that made Alara so effective in these settings. On the final day of the summit, during the closing ceremonies, each alpha was given the opportunity to speak about the outcomes and express gratitude to those who'd contributed significantly. When Darius took his turn, he spoke about the successful negotiations Iron Moon had participated in, the alliances they'd strengthened, the new initiatives they were supporting, and then he turned to Alara. "None of this would have been possible without my Luna," he said, his voice carrying pride that made Alara's chest tight with emotion. Alara came to Iron Moon 3 years ago as a rejected Omega, with nothing but her knowledge, her kindness, and her unshakable dedication to preserving what makes our wolf culture beautiful. She could have been broken by rejection. Instead, she chose to become stronger. She could have hidden her gifts. Instead, she shared them freely with any pack willing to learn. She is the embodiment of what a Luna should be, not through dominance or political maneuvering, but through wisdom, compassion, and an unshakable commitment to building something better than what came before. The hall erupted in applause, wolves from every pack showing their respect and admiration. Alara stood, accepting the acknowledgement with grace, feeling the weight of how far she'd come. 3 years ago, she'd been kneeling in a bonding dress, devastated by rejection. Today, she stood as Luna of one of the most respected packs in the territories, valued and honored, powerful in ways Kieran had never imagined possible. As the applause died down and wolves began to mingle for the final reception, Kieran approached one last time. But this time, Serafina wasn't with him. This time, he looked tired and defeated in ways that had nothing to do with physical strength. "I owe you an apology," he said, without preamble. "Not the hollow one I gave you after the rejection, but a real one. I was wrong, Alara. Wrong about you, wrong about what makes a good Luna, wrong about what strength looks like. Watching you this week, seeing what you've accomplished, understanding what I threw away, it's been brutal. But I deserve that brutality. I deserve to see exactly how magnificent you are and know that I was too stupid to recognize it when I had the chance. Alara looked at him, this alpha who'd once had the power to destroy her with his words, and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no pain, no satisfaction. Just a distant sort of curiosity about why she'd ever thought his opinion mattered. I accept your apology, she said calmly. Not because you deserve forgiveness, but because I deserve peace. I've spent 3 years building a life I'm proud of, Kieran. I'm not interested in carrying around resentment for you. That would give you power over me that you no longer have and never deserved in the first place. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. You said you were wrong about what strength looks like, but I don't think you've really learned that lesson yet. Because true strength isn't about admitting you made a mistake after you've seen proof of what I accomplished. True strength would have been recognizing my value before I had to prove it to the entire territory. True strength would have been looking at the Omega you claimed to love and seeing past your own narrow expectations to who she really was. You didn't do that, and that failure says everything about your limitations as a leader and as a mate. Kieran flinched, as if she'd struck him, but he didn't argue. Because how could he? Everything she'd said was true, and they both knew it. I hope you find happiness with Serafina, Alara continued, her voice softening slightly. I hope you learn to value her for who she is rather than what she can do for your political aspirations. And I hope that someday you'll understand that the greatest gift the moon goddess ever gave you wasn't the mate bond with me. It was the rejection I had to suffer through, because that rejection freed both of us to find where we truly belonged. She walked away from him for the final time, heading back to Darius and their delegation, leaving Kieran standing alone in the middle of the reception hall. And as she linked arms with her true mate, feeling the bond between them warm and permanent and absolutely right, Alara realized something profound. She'd thought this summit would be about proving herself to Kieran, about showing him what he'd lost, but it had actually been about proving something to herself, proving that she'd healed completely, that his rejection no longer had any power over her, that she'd become everything she was meant to be, not despite being rejected, but because of it. The journey back to Iron Moon was peaceful. Alara spent most of it pressed against Darius's side, talking about the summit outcomes and the new initiatives they wanted to implement. They discussed expanding the cultural preservation program, hosting diplomatic training sessions for young wolves from allied packs, maybe even writing a formal history of Iron Moon that could serve as a template for other packs. They made plans for the future, together, as equals, as partners in every way that mattered. When they finally arrived home, the pack greeted them with celebration. News of Alara's summit success had traveled fast, and Iron Moon wolves were proud of their Luna who'd represented them so well. Young pups ran up to her with questions about the other packs she'd met. Elders wanted to hear about the historical documents she'd referenced. Warriors congratulated her on securing new training exchanges with allied packs. She was surrounded by love and respect and genuine appreciation for who she was and what she'd accomplished. That night, lying in bed with Darius, Alara finally allowed herself to process everything that had happened over the past 3 years. The rejection that had nearly destroyed her, the long journey to Iron Moon, the slow healing process, the discovery of her true mate, the growth into her role as Luna and cultural keeper, the confrontation with Kieran that had proven she'd moved past his dismissal of her. It was a complete arc, a full circle, a story of devastation and resurrection. "Do you ever regret it?" Darius asked quietly in the darkness. "The pain you went through, the rejection, the hard road to get here? Would you change it if you could?" Alara thought about the question seriously. Would she erase the pain of rejection if given the chance? Would she choose to have never experienced the humiliation, the devastation, the long months of healing? The answer surprised her with its certainty. "No," she said firmly, "I wouldn't change any of it, because that pain shaped me into who I am now. It taught me that I'm stronger than I thought, more resilient, more capable of surviving things I believed would destroy me. It led me to Iron Moon, to you, to work that matters, and a life I love. If I'd stayed with Kieran, if he'd never rejected me, I'd be living a shadow life. I'd be trying to fit into a role that was never meant for me, suppressing parts of myself to match his expectations, forever wondering if I was enough. But because of the rejection, I found where I truly belong. I found my purpose, my power, myself." She turned in his arms, looking up at his face in the moonlight streaming through their window. "I found you," she continued, "my true mate, my partner, the person who sees me completely and loves what he sees. That's worth every moment of pain I suffered to get here. Kieran's rejection wasn't the end of my story, Darius. It was the beginning of my real life." Darius kissed her, soft and sweet and full of love that would last lifetimes. "Then I'm grateful to him," he murmured, "grateful that he was stupid enough to let you go, that his limited vision pushed you toward me. His loss was the greatest gift I've ever received." Years later, when young Omegas would come to Luna Alara feeling broken and worthless after rejection or dismissal, she would tell them her story. She would explain that rejection doesn't define worth, that someone else's inability to see value doesn't mean that value doesn't exist, that sometimes being pushed away from the wrong thing is the moon goddess's way of guiding you toward the right thing. She would show them that there are many kinds of strength and gentleness, kindness, cultural knowledge, diplomatic skill. These are all forms of power that matter just as much as physical dominance or political connections. And when those young wolves asked how she survived the pain of rejection, how she rebuilt herself, how she became the respected Luna they saw before them, Alara would smile and tell them the truth. You survive by refusing to internalize someone else's limited vision of what you should be. You rebuild by finding wolves who recognize your value, and you become who you were always meant to be by having the courage to embrace your gifts instead of apologizing for them. Rejection isn't the end. Sometimes it's the beginning of everything you were supposed to become. The story of Luna Alara and Alpha Kieran's rejection became legend in the Northern Territories, not as a romance or a tale of redemption for the Alpha who'd made a mistake, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of judging worth by narrow standards. Kieran's name became synonymous with missed opportunities and limited vision. Meanwhile, Alara's name became synonymous with resilience, wisdom, and the quiet power of refusing to be diminished by others' inability to see your value. Silvercrest Pack struggled under Kieran's leadership, losing allies and influence, as his reputation for valuing status over substance became widely known. Iron Moon flourished, becoming a beacon for wolves who valued tradition, culture, and the understanding that strength comes in many forms. And at the center of it all was Luna Alara, the rejected Omega, who'd become one of the most powerful and respected leaders in the territories, not through conquest or political maneuvering, but through wisdom, compassion, and an unshakable commitment to preserving what made wolf culture beautiful. She never saw Kieran again after that summit, heard about him occasionally, updates on Silvercrest's declining influence, rumors about tensions in his mating with Serafina, whispers that he'd become obsessed with what he'd lost. But those stories didn't touch her. They were about someone else's life, someone else's regrets, someone else's inability to move forward. Alara was too busy living her own extraordinary life to waste energy on the alpha who'd once dismissed her as worthless. And every night, as she fell asleep, wrapped in Darius's arms with the mate bond warm and constant between them, surrounded by the pack that valued her and engaged in work that mattered, Alara would offer a silent thank you to the moon goddess. Thank you for Kieran's rejection. Thank you for the pain that made me stronger. Thank you for pushing me out of the wrong life so I could find the right one. Thank you for showing me that being told I'm not enough by the wrong person means nothing when the right person sees exactly how much I've always been worth. The rejected Omega became the revered Luna. The dismissed teacher became the respected cultural keeper. The heartbroken girl became the wise woman who helped others heal from their own rejections. And the alpha who'd said she'd never be his Luna lived with the knowledge that she'd sat on his enemy's throne, worn the title he'd denied her, and become everything he'd claimed she couldn't be, not for revenge, not to prove him wrong, but simply because she'd finally found where she belonged and been given the chance to show what she'd always been capable of becoming. That's the real ending to this story, not revenge or vindication or an alpha's belated recognition of his mistake. The real ending is a woman who learned that her worth was never determined by someone else's ability to see it, who built a life she was proud of despite devastating rejection, who found her true mate and her true purpose by refusing to be broken by dismissal. The real ending is understanding that sometimes the worst thing that ever happens to you is actually the best thing because it forces you to become who you were always meant to be. And when young wolves ask Luna Alara if she ever forgave Kieran for rejecting her, she always gives the same answer. Forgiveness implies he had power over me that needed to be released, but he never had that power, not really. He had the ability to hurt me, yes, but he never had the ability to define me, to limit me, to determine my worth. That power was always mine. And once I reclaimed it, once I understood that his rejection said everything about his limitations and nothing about my value, there was nothing left to forgive. There was only a life to build, a purpose to fulfill, and a love to embrace. That's not forgiveness. That's freedom. And it's the greatest gift I've ever given myself.